All right, well, welcome to the panel on SpeedGaming. If you've never heard of SpeedGaming, we're a network of channels on Twitch. We put on all kinds of tournaments, events, showcase races, all kinds of things. We're a community-driven channel, set of channels. We base our content on what people are playing, what things are going on in the community. We work with groups, there's all kinds of platforms. We've been in operation for over 3 years now. And it's just sort of expanded, and we've essentially, through this time, we've had to face a lot of challenges, done a lot of things that no one has had to deal with before, and the purpose of our panel is to sort of talk about the lessons we learned along the way and how we faced some of the challenges that we have faced and some of the things that we are trying to do to adapt to the future, and hopefully provide some lessons that other people who are trying to do similar things, put together organized community channels or organize events in general, what kind of lessons they can learn to help them do that, as well as just give people who participate as players or as commentators or trackers a sense of what goes on behind the scenes with something like this. And so we're going to start by doing introductions. I'll go first. I'm Srl. I created the channel originally. I started speedrunning back in 2007, with mostly NES games, mostly really bad ones, and I joined Speed Demos Archive around that time. I was at the first Games Done Quick, classic Games Done Quick, and that's where I started really getting in touch with the community and starting to, going to those events, put me in touch with a lot of people. And that gradually led into, I'll get into this a little bit later, starting a podcast called The Sunday Sequence Break, from which we spawned off a competition show that we did with that, which kind of turned into tournaments and gradually, bit by bit led to what we're doing now. Here we got Mythical. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mythical9. I joined SpeedGaming in 2014. Originally, as a when you mentioned when you first started speedrunning, I first started speedrunning in 2013 because of SpeedGaming. Back before it was SpeedGaming, it was a SpeedGaming League, and since then I joined as kind of mostly as a host and commentator, but I started working more closely with Srl on organizing, and over the years I've helped with a little bit of everything basically. And then up until we were able to bring on some new staff members, they've taken over, and nowadays I do more of a advisory sort of role, and I also help out with a lot of our higher profile special events.
I'm Clifford. I started speedrunning and speed walking in 2015. In 2016, I really started running, mostly linked. Got involved with the randomizer in 2017, became one of the main restreamers for the secondary fall randomizer tournament. And then in the December of that year, I was DMing a D&D game, and in the middle of it, I got a message, "Hey, do you want to come work for me with SpeedGaming?" And then the rest of the night, my whole D&D game sucked. I couldn't even concentrate. It was awful. Since then, I've been working as a stage manager and a tournament manager, making sure everything runs smoothly in the day-to-day. With my good friends here, I'll let Taku go next.
Hello, I'm Sakura. I started speedrunning during the first A Link to the Past randomizer tournament. I was heavily involved in commentary after being eliminated in the first round of the tournament. So Srl approached me back in the fall 2017 tournament, and ever since I started off as a tournament organizer, stage manager, and the volunteer coordinator for SpeedGaming. But more recently, I've just been focusing on the volunteer coordinator role.
I'm Adirondack Rook, and I'm the schedule manager for SpeedGaming. I started speedrunning in 2015 with Zelda 1 and the any % no up and A category, and it started blossoming there with randomizers and such, Zelda 1 randomizer, Link to the Past randomizer, and just like with Clifford and Saku, in the fall 2017, Srl approached me about helping him out, and ever since then I've been doing the scheduling, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We have 3 members of our staff who are not here, unfortunately, due to their life priorities. We're going to shout out to Keikamen Shoyu and JC, as well as Twain, who is one of our most recent staff members.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and also Willard J. Bradley was another hire that we brought on, along with these guys who eventually left a couple months ago, I guess, but he did great work while he was here, so definitely shout outs to him too.
Tournament manager, and right there, the daily race, he was the guy who got the daily races started on SpeedGaming, and did a lot of great tournament manager work and stage manager stuff. So yeah, shout outs to Willard if you're watching. All right, so Mythical, I have a question for you. Why tournaments?
Yeah, well, there's probably a lot of reasons for this, but we've kind of identified what are some of the core reasons. And I think the biggest thing is just for a long time, there wasn't a lot of people for any one game. It just didn't make any sense. But as streaming services like Twitch came about, high-profile events like these GDQ marathons, the speedrunning scene just blew up, huge, rapid growth. And as communities grew, it was only natural that they started looking for things to do together. It's just more fun, plain and simple. You know, the reason 2,000 of us are gathered here at this hotel is just because it is so fun to do things together. The other thing is tournaments are a different sort of competition than typical speedrunning, you know, uploading your PB to a leaderboard. It's not a profound difference, but a speedrun does change in a race. There, you know, players are tested in new ways. You need to be consistent, adapt, recover from mistakes, and you need to be able to perform under pressure. And based off of your ability to do these things, you need to make new decisions. So there's just as much merit to competing in a race or tournament as there is to competing for a world record. The last thing is that tournaments are a chance for communities to grow, not just in size, but also in depth. You know, a tourney happens and things happen. A community leader steps into a tournament organizer role and they find it really fulfilling. An artist produces a really good restream layout. A runner with poor execution but a wealth of knowledge suddenly becomes a great commentator. A new runner makes a big splash, upsets a favorite. That favorite is inspired to get back in the lab and work on some new stuff. Through a tournament, there's a number of ways that people can grow and find their place in a community. So it really does all come down to people in the end, I suppose. But now that we know, why tournaments kind of got started and why they continue to gain traction even today, we can take a look at the history of how tournaments kind of got started and how speed gaming fits into it.
Yeah, so it's kind of foggy. There's not really a lot of record about what some of the early tournaments were and, what happened with them. But to the best of my recollection, here's what I've got. So the first tournaments that I remember in speedrunning were from Speed Demo's archive. They were all run through the forums. They would do like a weekly mystery tournament once or twice a year. In, let's say, 2006, 7, 8, 9, around then, they would do a couple of them, I know, and Hasa was one of the guys who organized a bunch of those. And it would be like every week a new game would be announced, and everyone would post either their score or their time or like what level they got to if it was like some game where most people weren't finishing. And then they would sort of aggregate the results, and at the end of the 6 weeks or whatever, they would post the winners. None of this was streamed. In fact, they didn't even require video proof at that point. It was all just on the honor system, right? The first tournament that's maybe more like what we would call a tournament is the SRL Mystery Tournament, because SRL, Speedruns Live, had a huge blind racing community that, it was one of the biggest things about it other than actual normal racing was the blind community there. So the Mystery Tournament, the first one that they did was in December of 2012. There were 32 players in it, and I believe they did it, they restreamed it all on Speedruns Live, and I believe they did it in 1 or 2 days. It was just a short little weekend tournament. And Mystery Tournament, has gone through many iterations. There's probably over 10 of them by now.
13.
13, jeez. And it's one of the biggest tournaments, still one of the biggest tournaments there is. So that was the case, and Speedruns Live actually did restream that. During that time, there was also a few other tournaments. We're not exactly sure which, but between Super Mario 1, Super Mario 3, and Super Mario World, I'd say 2 out of 3 of those had actual tournaments that none of it got restreamed. It was all just organized by the members of the community. So those were the first tournaments I was really aware of. Then in January of 2015, Speedruns Live put on what they called the Get Yourself Speedrunning Tournament. So following up AGDQ, they realized there's lots of people who are discovering speedrunning for the first time through GDQ. So we want to try to get those people into the fold here, get them using Speedruns Live, get them realizing they can interact and race against each other, and so kind of helping people learn some new games. So they did the first Get Yourself Speedrunning Tournament with Mario 3, Link to the Past, and Sonic 2 was, I believe, the first one. I think Blecky was the person who organized it. There he is. Yeah, good job. That guy has done a lot for speedrunning. Thank you. So yes, Speedruns Live was where a lot of what we see today got its start, and it's still in operation. Join Speedruns Live and race there if you haven't. So what was going on during that time in my personal timeline? Around February of 2012, I started a podcast along with Flicky, PJ, and Duckfist doing called The Sunday Sequence Break. It was the first speedrun podcast that I'm aware of, and it ran from February 2012 to January of 2015. We put out about 150 episodes, and and we did a lot with that, and it was kind of cool, nice rallying point for people to to tune into and submit their records and talk about games and things like that. And off that, I made a spin-off, which I wanted to do some kind of competition. I made a spin-off show of that called SpeedGaming League. That started in October of 2013, and the idea was we present players with a couple of games, and we give them a short amount of time to practice and to learn a route. There's usually doing like a really short goal, like a 5-minute segment of a run or something like that, and just to sort of test what your general ability is in speedrunning. So not based on the amount of experience you had, but based on like how quickly you can route and practice and execute to try to beat everyone else's PBs within a fixed period of time. And so that was sort of the first like competition thing that I did. And it was eventually we did a whole season of that. It took about 2 years, and we wanted to do like a final, like a 64-person playoff tournament of SpeedGaming League for season 1. And that's when I created the SpeedGaming channel, the first SpeedGaming channel. That was, I guess, January of 2015 that we set that up. So from there, at this point, Mythical9 had started as a player in SpeedGaming League and decided that he enjoyed working out behind the scenes and working doing commentary and things like that. And so he and I ended up doing commentary together for most of SpeedGaming League. And I'll let him tell the next part of the story here.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. At first, and then it remained fun, but also as I started to accept more responsibilities, it started to become a lot more work. So, but I did enjoy it very much. The tournament that we put on, 64 people, was a lot of work. But I think considering it was our first major tournament, we did a really, really great job on it. And it was around that time, I think, that the channel, by the time we did the tournament for the season finale is when the channel got partnered at that point, I think.
Yeah, about then.
About then. So, our efforts were really starting to show, and it was that was really exciting. So we finished the first season. Shout-outs to Andy, actually, I think is sitting back there, our grand champion for season 1.
That guy's really good.
He is really good.
There was some tough competition.
It was.
Yeah.
It absolutely was. But we finished, and during our downtime, we heard about a tournament for Zelda 2 starting up, and Zelda 2 is a game that Feasel has run for a long time. It's a really big game for him. So we had this new partnered Twitch channel just kind of sitting there and no show going anymore. So we said, yeah, let's do it. Let's restream some matches. So through trial and error, we learned kind of the basics of tournament organizing and restreaming, and I think the most important thing was that we learned how to work with other people. Until that point, it had just been Feasel and I on the organization side of things. We had Arcano was a volunteer who would do a bit of commentary and stuff, but organization was just us. So now we were working with other people in a community, and it was a bit of a challenge at first, but it's become such an integral part of what we do that it was really important that we got that experience way back with Zelda 2. By the time Zelda 2 was winding down, Zelda 1 randomizer tournament was starting up, and we kind of guessed, and we ended up being right, that the tournament scene was just going to continue to grow. And we were getting pretty good results in terms of viewers, and we were enjoying what was happening. It was exciting, so we decided we wanted to continue following along with the tournament scene. And we had always talked about doing SGL Season 2. We actually did a pilot episode at some point, but it was a lot of work to run SGL. We had to find new games and new goals each week, finding players each week. So we ended up kind of having to choose between tournaments and SGL Season 2. So we said, we'll push it back. We'll push it back and focus on tournaments. To this day, it's still pushed back.
It'll happen eventually.
2022, it's coming.
Yeah.
But it's a really cool thing. It's really unique even today, so we would absolutely love to bring it back. And every time we hear people say that they miss it or they loved it or something, we hear you. So thank you so much for that. But we started to continue to follow tournaments, except we tried something new back in March of 2016, we for some reason we thought it wouldn't be so much work to do a marathon instead of.
It's easy. It's easy to do a 10-day marathon.
It's just a couple days. It's not like ongoing every week. Yeah, that was wrong. We had both become involved with the Best of NES marathon, which is a marathon of NES games with world record holders playing through all the games, the best of the NES.
Right. Shout out to Bad Breaks and Dexter.
Absolutely. And it seemed like a pretty natural continuation to do something for other consoles. So we were like, someone's going to beat us to it. Let's do it ourselves. And we both love the Super Nintendo, so we created the SNES Marathon 2016.
The SNES Runs Marathon.
SNES Runs Marathon.
Isn't that a great name?
Yeah. That was bad. That was a dumb name.
I bought the domain for it. I still have the domain.
And then Mikey McSee gave us the much better name of SNES Superstars. And we've done 3 years now. It's one of our most successful events. The first time we did it, we made a number of mistakes. We didn't get proper contact information from the runners beforehand, so we had to manually track down all the runners through whatever social media they were on. Is this guy on Twitter? Is this guy on Speedrun, Twitch, Discord? It was a nightmare. But we also had some really major successes, particularly on the tech side. Feasel had created something just for this event, a web page that I could use to operate the restream remotely. It was the first time someone other than the restreamer was able to crop someone's stream, sync up 2 runners, adjust audio sync, things like that. So Feasel worked tirelessly on much of the player scheduling and coordination on top of developing these new tools, and it damn near killed him, but the results were astounding. SpeedGaming hit a 4-digit viewer count for the first time. I think we hit like 2,000 viewers, a factor of 10 higher than anything we had ever had before. It was pretty crazy. It was very hard to do because Feasel was away 12 and 16 hours restreaming, and then he would sleep and I would do the other 6 to 8. And we just went like that for 10 days. It was the longest marathon anyone had ever done at the time. Nowadays, we've been beaten by default by the really, really long-a-thon that has Batten Kaitos running for 2 weeks straight. Kind of hard to compete with that, but point of pride back then. After that, our next major projects around April and May were just doing tournaments for some really popular games. We did Minish Cap, we did Super Metroid, and we did A Link to the Past. And these all got really good numbers in terms of players and viewers, and it really helped establish SpeedGaming as the tournament channel. It was... yeah, it's both of those, all 3 of those games. Well, I don't know, we haven't done Minish Cap in a while, but certainly A Link to the Past and Super Metroid have become a cornerstone of what we have on the channel. We also did a tournament for Blaster Master, which is certainly not in the same league as those in terms of popularity and things, but it was the first time that me and Feasel were the main admins and organizers for the tournament. So instead of relying on community members to make decisions, it would often fall to us. So when a new out-of-bounds technique was discovered mid-tournament, we had to figure out, like, are we going to allow this, are we not? And we had to, weighing those kinds of things and making those decisions, we realized it's not so easy sometimes. So it became really important that we always had community members to really work closely with on things like that, because you really want to trust the community on stuff like that. One of the cooler things we did was a 2-weekend Swiss tournament for Ninja Gaiden 2 that was primarily organized by Sinister One, and they had little player cards with profiles for the top 8, and it at the time was a step above anything we had ever done in production, so I think pretty fondly on that. And after that, things just started to accelerate. Tourneys were taken off, and it became clear that in order to keep up, we'd need to come up with like some new tools.
Right, yeah. See, at that point, we'd had enough visibility that lots of members of lots of different communities were coming to us all the time saying, hey, we want to do a tournament. And like at that time, really things could only be run by myself or Mythical. And so it was, with the amount of content that we had and the amount of new content coming in, it was just way too much for us to manage on our own. So one of the things that we really, really needed to do was get our tech in a better spot. Because at that point, we were still doing broadcasts, the standard, like, manual way, like make the layouts, all the scene elements for each of the player names. It's, you know, a little title text here, title text there, a background, you know, element, a screen capture element, and having to make these layouts up by hand, and all kinds of issues where, like, if you have 2 instances of VLC and one of them, like, the screen goes down, so the other one, like, duplicates the same thing twice. I don't know if you guys have probably seen that, right? So dealing with stuff like that, or if, and back then, like, the Twitch player would have a lot of problems where, like, if the person started dropping a lot of frames, the player would just pause itself. And so if I wasn't sitting there at my computer to, like, restart it, people, you know, chat would just go nuts for 20 minutes until I got back, you know, to restart that person's stream. So clearly we needed better tools. So at that point, I started adapting the tools that I'd made originally for SpeedGaming League. SpeedGaming League actually had some incredibly advanced tools. We were not just using the, you know, the elements of like OBS or something like that. I actually had a software which generated the layouts automatically, would update the little, like, the leaderboards on the screen, and we were actually, like, ingesting the video and synchronizing it and, like, displaying it frame by frame, all handled within our rendering tools. But a lot of that stuff really wasn't too suitable for the kind of tournament stuff that we did. Particularly the fact that SpeedGaming League didn't have sound. We just played background audio, so we never actually had to worry about, you know, getting audio from the streams and syncing that up. So at that point, it was absolutely necessary that we needed to improve the software tools, and that's kind of like one of the first big lessons we learned, other than like how to work with community members, is you really got to have a good set of tools and be confident with them, and make it easy enough that other people can use it, because, you know, you start out yourself just, you know, trying to do everything yourself, but eventually you reach the point where it's just going to grow too big for you, and you need to start relying on others. Everything has to be clear, easy to use, and clearly documented so that you can teach other people to do what you're doing. So that was a big lesson we learned right there. So for the rest of 2017, things kind of got bigger and bigger, lots of new stuff coming, you know, constantly to improve the tools. And then the thing that really caused us to look like the SpeedGaming that you know today is what we call December Madness. So I had been talking with Twitch, talking with Sinister One, who was the new community contact for speedrunning at Twitch at that time. And we were talking about, you know, what can we do? What's a big, you know, event that we can do to really, like, bootstrap SpeedGaming up to be something, like, bigger, and, you know, what's the vision of what we want the channels to look like? And, you know, what's the best way to do it? Well, let's, like, pick a sort of a microcosm of what I want SpeedGaming's vision to look like. What would that be? So we put together, I think we did 5 tournaments, 4 big tournaments and one small tournament, and we picked out, you know, a couple dozen showcase races, relay races, just various things that we wanted to do. We reached out to every community that we had any kind of contact with and said, what do you want to, like, we want to put something together. What do you guys want to show off? And we got a relatively small grant from Twitch to do this for a month. And that was the time that we upped our game. I bought a couple of new computers, so we'd have a computer for each of the channel. We expanded it to 4 channels, because at that time we were only on 2. And we brought on staff. And these wonderful people we have here, and plus a few more, were brought on. It was also really caused us to stop and, like, analyze what are the different parts of the responsibilities, because I, you know, was doing, Mythical and I were doing basically everything at the time, so how do we break things down? So we said, all right, we need to have a person in charge of scheduling, we need to have a person in charge of, like, stage managing, making sure things work out. We want to start bringing in volunteers, because that was a big thing, is starting to bring in more people who get small amounts of time with a very, like, self-contained task, you know, not to you know, feel like there's something they need to be working on all, but, like, when they have a little bit of, you know, a few hours here and there and they want to help out, you know, how can we give them a nice, you know, self-contained task that is easily enough understood that they can do it themselves without having to get input from everyone else to make it work. So basically breaking our whole operation down to little digestible parts, you know, both on the volunteer side and on the staff side was really critical. So that took a lot of thinking, and I think anybody has a channel or any kind of organization that's kind of growing to the point where it's going beyond them needs to really, like, spend a day or two just, like, writing down what are all the things that you do and just trying to group it together and decide, you know, what stuff can be delegated, what stuff requires a lot of specific technical knowledge, and what stuff you can teach anybody to do. And so that was huge for us. And after December of that year, it was really successful. After December of 2017, SpeedGaming looks a lot like what you see now in terms of our tools and in terms of our structure and, you know, the kind of output that we're producing. So that was huge for us, very successful. So a bunch of things came out of this December Madness, a bunch of lessons that we learned, and a bunch of just, you know, reactions from the community. So one of the things we realized is that something that was really lacking was we needed a better scheduling system, because it was still all being handled by hand. poor Rick had like 20 different spreadsheets, like one for each of the tournaments we were doing, and you'd have to check it like every hour to see if something new came on the spreadsheet, and you have to add it to our Google calendars, manually adding things to all 4 of our Google calendars.
I blame that for all my gray hairs.
Right, yeah, poor Rick. We're lucky that he survived. I'm glad you could be with us today, Rick. And so that definitely needed a better system for automating the way the schedule, like a centralized system for how the scheduling worked. So it wasn't just every tournament has its own thing and it's all completely different and one person has to monitor them all. Another thing we realized that we needed to do is make the tools easier to use for people who who have minimum amount of training. So you don't need to know everything about how streams work to be able to use the tools.
Yeah,
and that was
all of our volunteers who are familiar with the remotes and stuff we have, you should have seen the first iteration.
The first version, yeah.
Just a mess of buttons and text. And
if you think there's a lot of text now, if you go to the advanced control panel, I mean, you should have seen like there was just buttons and stuff everywhere. It was
cropping.
a mess.
The cropping.
Oh, all the cropping
worst.
by hand. Oh my gosh, I don't know if anyone remembers that, but that took a lot of time.
Enter numbers.
Yeah. All right, but some good things came out of this too. We had a ton of new volunteers. Lots of people saw it and got excited by what we were doing. And I mean, I think that's sort of like a lesson for a lot of people. They start out and they think, well, what do how do I get other people interested in this? I mean, you really just have to put in the time and you have to just, put your product out there and you just have to say to people, we would like your help. If you'd like to help out behind the scenes, come get in contact with me. I'm happy to help. And having a volunteer coordinator, a person who's actually in charge of reaching out to these people and getting them, bringing them into the fold and teaching them what to do is extremely important. That's a full-time, task to be doing just that. And basically, lots of new tournaments, lots of new events, just more and more people coming to us, and that really kind of caused things to grow from there. So with all these new events coming in, it turns out one of the biggest tasks that I didn't even think was going to be a big task is like intaking new events. People come to you with kind of a vague idea. Oh, we want to do something. There's a lot of players of this game. We want to do something. Like, what can we do? There's a lot of steps between getting from that point to actually digesting it down into a physical format. We're going to do this. These are the parameters. These are the people who are working on it. This is when it starts. This is when it ends. These are the rules. So that's the whole job in and of itself, is planning new events.
Yeah, you pretty much nailed it right there. But we can dig in a little more. Sometimes an organizer does come to us with an idea, and that's usually easier. But sometimes an event planning starts with us. We take a look at what's popular in speedrunning, or what's never been done before, or what we just think would be fun. And then we go out and seek community members who are willing to help us put on an event like this. It's usually the case that we find people who are excited and willing and just needed a little bit of a push. And in cases like that, then we can sit down and start to iron out details. One of the biggest things that needs to be decided is format. There's only a couple things that we tend to do on the channel, but certain things work better than others. If you've got a really big active community, it's usually safe to jump right into a major tournament. But if you're a smaller community, then you might want to showcase a head-to-head race between 2 of your best players, or a relay race between a couple members of your community. And decisions need to be made on category. You want to be looking at run length. You want to be looking at how difficult or unsafe the route might be. And then you really need to try hard to anticipate any additional rules you might need for how this game plays as a race. For example, a lot of Mega Man games will allow you to continue from a password if you soft lock, because otherwise your run just dies right there. So these are things that can be anticipated, but oftentimes aren't, and then you need to start making rules mid-tournament. And so that's always dicey, but sometimes it's what needs to happen. We do our best in trying to nip those in the bud during the planning phase. The last thing we look at mostly during planning is time frame. Particularly for us, we've always got a ton of stuff happening, and so we try to stagger things so that some things are ending and some things are starting. We also want to make sure that we're not overlapping too much with other similar events. maybe both in terms of what viewers want to see. We don't want too much of one thing, but particularly in terms of players. You want to be looking at player base. You know, if you've got a Mega Man X tournament and Mega Man X2 is coming up, a lot of runners overlap between those two games, and you really don't want to be forcing players to choose between the two or try to juggle both. It can be pretty stressful and draining being part of a tournament, so we really don't want to do that to our players, so we'll try to shift things and make sure everything lines up. In some cases, we can try to make long-term plans to grow a community or develop players. We recently held events for Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, and we started with a beginner-friendly, much shorter format, and over time we kind of escalated. We made like longer categories and introduced more and more, and eventually we did a full any % tournament for Oracle of Seasons, and that finished in October this year, so I think it was a pretty successful idea. Once we've got our details finalized, we can start to get things in motion. Contact artists, put together layouts and banners, add an entry to our database, create a challenge page or a Discord server if either of those is needed, and then we can start to announce and promote the event. And of course, once the event is running, we need people to keep it running.
And that's where I come in, along with Keku and formerly Willard when he was still with us. We handle all the tournaments from the SG side. Now, that's not to say that we're really adminning the tournaments, because for the bulk of things, the communities are putting on the tournaments. We're just running them. We want to make sure that we're in constant communication with the admins, because in these situations, the community is our client, right? And we want to make sure that they have all their needs met and that they feel like they're getting their needs met, because even if we're doing things and they don't realize it because we're not communicating well, then it's just the same as if we're not doing anything, right? You got to make sure communication is very important. And when between the two of us now, Keku and I, we're each running 6 to 8 events each, so it's very important to always be on top of things, because there's so much stuff happening, and get an admin ping over in the other direction, and like it could be important. Got to make sure it could have nothing to do with us, but be part of the admin team. But if it infects the channels, we want to be on top of it. Usually, in the management, it means making sure the tournament has momentum. Usually, you don't want to have one lower bracket match in your double elimination, just grinding the entire tournament to a halt. That just sucks for everybody involved, right? So sometimes you have to go, hey guys, what's going on over here? Do we need to herd some cats? Like, what's going on? And sometimes trying to get people together to run a thing is like herding cats, I'll tell you. And then sometimes, you know, if the admins aren't on even the group stages can drag, and so you want to make sure the things are scheduling consistently, and you have volunteers to commentate and track, because as the tournament goes on, people lose interest, and if you have 2-week break and nobody's got any matches, then the commentators lose interest, and then the whole thing just kind of falls apart, and that you never want to see that. And it's a delicate balance, because although we are partnered with these communities, we are a separate entity, so we don't want to just sit there and tell you how to run your tournament, because nobody wants that. Especially like if I don't run your game, you don't want me come and tell you how to run the game and how to run your event, and what, like with the Blaster Master thing, if you're running your event and the new glitch comes out, you don't want me coming in and saying, hey, you can't allow this. Like, I don't even run that game. So we want to leave it to the community to handle everything, because it's community tournaments. Occasionally we have our own tournaments, but even then when we're doing it, we try and partner with admins to have it that are knowledgeable more about the game from the community, so we can defer to them. But occasionally something happens, like in the Blaster Master, where we have to make a decision, and hopefully it all works. Then in some situations, in some games, it's okay to not have commentary, because the run's fairly simple or fairly long, and it's hard to find commentary, but it's straightforward, and you can watch and understand what's going on. And in other situations, there's like in randomizers, big for this. There's so much information happening and so much things going on, and with the tracker, you're kind of lost if you don't have commentary to keep it going and keep you engaged and know who's ahead or what's going on. Because if you just turn it on, you have no idea what's happening. Like, that guy's in Turtle Rock, and that guy's in Brinstar, and I don't have any idea. But so to speak more on commentary, I'm going to pass it on to Rick down here.
All right, well, first of all, yeah, there are certain things that, you know, one misconception with Speed Gaming is that we handle all of the commentary. If you are somebody here interested in doing commentary, you want to speak to the people who are behind the tournament, not us, but like, for example, with the Super Metroid Z3, the Compromiser there, you want to speak to somebody who's going to be in there. We do not set a lot of rules about it. We have a few things, like, for example, one thing, as we've learned over the years, is that the age demographic for people who are watching Speed Gaming, they're not just 18-year-olds. We found out that people are watching with their families, that they'd like to watch with their kids, that some of our demographics getting on that older scale, especially considering some of the games that we're playing. So we want to try to keep it PG-friendly. That doesn't mean that every single word that's out of your mouth has to be clean, but, well, if you start saying F and S words, let's just say that we're going to step in and say, you probably shouldn't be doing that. At least we'll step in with the admins. If that comes down to both something that I would have to do, or Clifford would have to do, or somebody here on the Speed Gaming staff would end up having to do. So, like I said, if anybody here is ever interested in doing commentary for a tournament, you want to start getting a hold of the admins. Now, certain tournaments have policies on how they deal with commentary. Some of them you have to go through an application process. Some of them, it's just straightforward. You're interested in doing commentary? Well, first of all, how's your mic sounding? Okay, perfect, fine, you're in. And, well, we would kind of like to have people who know what they're talking about, but sometimes the best commentators can fake it. Also, I just want to go and address something that Fiesel brought up about 30 minutes ago. You said that Speed Gaming started in January 2015, right?
Dun, dun, dun.
Yep.
Can we get a happy birthday from the crowd here?
Oh, yeah. Happy 3 years. Yeah. 3 years? Wow.
I mean, we're now 4 years old here. God, we're old. Now I'm going to turn it over to Saku. She's going to talk about something that we handle here with Speed Gaming. It's in partner with YouTube. It's also how you get to watch things like, for example, what you're seeing here on the screen. I know some of you guys have been distracted watching this. We're going to talk about VOD highlighting.
Hey, some of those clips are really close. I was pretty into it for a bit.
I mean, it's right here in front of my face. I've got this right here in my background. I've been distracted while Fiesel was talking.
So I get to talk about the fun stuff. So unfortunately, Keku isn't able to be here today, and this is normally what Keku handles. So today, I'm going to get to talk about it. So if you're running a tournament, something to keep in mind, of course, is going to be VOD highlighting. Now, a lot of runners, and not only runners, but commentators as well, like to keep records of their runs. And so it's something that definitely needs attention at some point if you're running a tournament channel. So for Speed Gaming originally, VODs were an afterthought. It was something that at the very beginning wasn't even really something that was being done. But people wanted to watch the races back, and so, yeah, we started doing some highlights. And now we actually have a whole group of people on YouTube who solely just watch VODs, don't watch any of the tournaments on Twitch or anything like that. So we've had to shift focus from trying to just export them as quickly as possible to making sure they're being exported in a proper order, because the last thing you want, of course, is for somebody to highlight the finals before the brackets or something and have the whole event spoiled for the people that are watching on YouTube.
And believe me, we do get comments about that.
Yep.
How dare you post this already? I've been spoiled on this.
So it's something that, like I said, it was an afterthought, but now something that we do have to keep in mind for future things. And another one of the challenges, of course, is the fact that most of our VODs are highlighted by volunteers. And so we need somebody like Keku, who is our who is our VOD manager, who just basically goes through all of the tournaments, lists all of their matches, and just makes sure that every single one of those videos are highlighted. And so as Clifford was mentioning earlier, I think you were saying that you and Keku each had like 6 tournaments. So it's like 12 tournaments. Some tournaments have, hundreds of matches a week, and so just making sure every single one of those VODs gets highlighted, and then especially when a tournament stagnates, going back and making sure that when it does pick up, that the VOD highlighter's been on vacation for a couple weeks. Do they even know that the tournament is back on? So, going into managing, making sure that everybody is on the ball. That's another thing that you may have to deal with. So Keku also has to deal with making sure that the titles, when those matches are exported to YouTube, there's particular titles, and actually those titles are very specific because that's how YouTube auto-adds those matches to their playlists. So instead of having to manually add every single match to, let's say, a Super Metroid tournament, the title is going to be very specific. The first the first 5 or 6 words are going to be the same. It's just going to be the runners' names that are different. And so YouTube is going to be like, okay, this is part of this tournament. So it'll automatically put that in there. So every time a new tournament comes in, making sure that that title and all the information is there for the volunteers to make sure they can copy and paste that into the export information section. And of course, VOD highlighting takes a while. Sometimes matches on SpeedGaming or the broadcast itself goes on for a long time. So the channel can go live at 9 in the morning and not go down until 2 in the morning. And so because of the way that our volunteers work, they're normally assigned to specific tournaments. And so they have to sift through multiple hours of this video to find this particular match. Some tournaments are 30 minutes, so if you're skipping through hours and hours, you just miss it and have to go through it again. And so, it's important to note that the volunteers who are putting in the work for VOD highlighting, they are putting in quite a bit of time.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Absolutely.
Highlighting VODs.
And in addition to that, they also got to keep up with what Twitch decides to change with the way that they highlight. Anyone who tries to highlight with Twitch knows that they're going to change the platform on how you highlight every 6 months, so you got to get used to it.
Yeah, there's normally a big conversation as soon as Twitch updates their VOD highlighting stuff in the Discord on when sometimes it's helpful, but in the format that we're doing it, sometimes not so much.
Thank you, Twitch.
So speaking about volunteers, then let's get into what I normally do. So, of course, after we had our staff members recruited, we transitioned into this is when we started using volunteers as well. So some of the challenges in incorporating the volunteers is ensuring that, of course, we have the tools to allow the volunteers to be able to help without having a lot of technical knowledge. So Fiesel created this very user-friendly interface that gives the volunteers access to the controls on the machines without them having direct access to the machines. So that was one of the big helpful things of when we brought in the volunteers, just making sure that they had those tools without needing, programming or anything else, any kind of background there. So when you think of volunteers for SpeedGaming, some of the first things that come to mind, of course, are the ones that you see in public. So people like commentators, trackers, chat moderators. Those are kind of like, when you think volunteers, those are kind of the ones that come to mind. But there's often a lot of people running things in the background. So like I mentioned earlier, we have our VOD highlighters. We also have people in software development as well. We have setup helpers who are making sure that the matches are started on time, getting race rooms set up, and making sure commentators are in their proper Discords. We have broadcast operators.
Can I just quickly get a round of applause of the people who are here amongst us that are the setup helpers and volunteers?
Yeah, thank you all very much. We would not be able to run Speed Gaming without all this wonderful volunteer help.
We also have broadcast operators who deal with any technical issues during the broadcasts. Normally they work hand in hand with the setup helpers as well. And tournament helpers, so these are the people who, if a tournament is, let's say, fairly large and the admins need a little bit of help, they'll come in and they'll help record maybe like the challenge win data and other things like that, and also help make sure that their matches have trackers and commentators. So, and there's again many more volunteers. And as we have so many volunteers, it became very necessary to have someone oversee, train, and coordinate them. It's also very important if you're going to be having volunteers to have a proper system in place for intaking, training, and monitoring them to make sure that, you know, any issues that they may have or you have proper communication with your volunteers, because that's something that's definitely very vital. And while using volunteers has helped us to maintain the large amount of broadcasts we do per day, it also comes with some larger issues. And particularly one of the more complicated issues is when a volunteer's actions don't necessarily align with, let's say, Speed Gaming's ethics. So, of course, our number one priority is going to be, you know, making sure that the communities are taken care of. And if a volunteer is acting out of line or causing any issues, you know, that's something that if you're running a channel, you're going to have to take into consideration and address. So some of the things that, you know, we've been able to do is if it's just maybe if there's a volunteer who's maybe rubbing the community the wrong way, you can move them over to another tournament, you know, talk with them and help them through, because people just want to help. And so, you can talk them through, try to get them on another tournament and see if things go from there. But if it just doesn't work out, then sometimes you just have to, you know, remove them from being a volunteer. And so that's something that you have to consider if you're going to be putting volunteers into positions to work with the community as well. So. And again, it's also important to note, as Rick mentioned earlier, that the individual communities have their own volunteers as well. So commentators and trackers are normally handled most of the time by their individual communities. And again, what was mentioned before, some communities will audition their commentators. Some will just say, all right, guys, let's ping in the Discord, the admins, and if you ping us, we'll give you the role. And so it becomes really complicated to keep the standard across the board for commentary because of the different standards within each community. So, and then the last thing I want to note about volunteers itself is that training volunteers does take an awful lot of time as well, especially with online. There's people from all across the globe, so all time zones, and so having one particular person to train them becomes a little bit interesting when just schedules don't line up. So for me, myself, what I've done is I've actually created training videos. And so when somebody joins our volunteer team, they get a training role, they get access to the videos, and they go through the videos. If they have any questions, you know, they can contact me. And I'm able to kind of walk them through things, get them set up with their roles, and then start the next, you know, monitoring and making sure that they're doing well within their community. So you're definitely going to need to plan for some sort of time sync, either with making some sort of training package or by manually training each individual volunteer.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things that you brought up there is a lot of what we do has to do, especially as things get bigger and bigger and more people get involved, like being really clear about whose responsibility is what, and being clear about what stuff is the responsibility of the community members, what stuff's the responsibility of the staff members of SpeedGaming and the volunteers of SpeedGaming, etc. And one of the things that I found most unexpected is how much diplomacy is involved in this. I mean, I'm an engineer, and yet I spend most of my time like talking to people and trying to make sure that people understand each other and are on the same page. Dealing with disputes, because that will inevitably happen, disputes between within the community or between players and administrators, between volunteers and community volunteers and other volunteers. And you just got to remember that this is video games. We're here to have fun, and a lot of people are just putting in their time because they love it, and they're not getting paid, or they're not like gonna get Twitch famous because of their involvement with this. And so, like, the most important thing is just keeping a good attitude, a good atmosphere, making it something that people like enjoy coming back to over and over again. And misunderstandings happen a lot, especially just because this is textual media. People are typing to each other. You don't get to see facial expressions or tone, and a lot of times just people misunderstand each other. And usually, all it takes is you just be honest and non-confrontational, and just try to be understanding of where the other person's coming from. Sometimes when someone says something that it sounds like they're flying off the handle, maybe they are having just a really bad day. We all have bad days, and you can't take back something that you've written. I mean, there it is. So sometimes really it's just a matter of getting opening the lines of communication, getting people to sit down with each other, and just being understanding and not jumping to conclusions. But quite honestly, like, that's probably one of the hardest things that I didn't expect was going to be hard about running SpeedGaming, is just dealing with all the people and just the diplomacy issues involved in all that. I don't want to take too much time. Yeah, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for viewer questions. So I wanted to mention that there's a lot of tools that we use. We use tools for restreaming, tools for controlling the broadcast, tools for people to schedule their matches, for commentators to schedule, trackers to schedule. Make sure you get if you have a channel, get a nice a Twitch chat bot, so you can have messages for the Twitch chat. And we found a Discord bot to be very helpful to give out information for commentators or for people who want to sign up for different things. But the one tool that we really couldn't replace, one task we couldn't replace by tools, was the actual act of making the schedule up, assigning things to channels. And that's why Rick's job is, continues to be one of the most important jobs that we have. Because all these matches come in, and you may see on our schedule, they come in as like gray as their initial color, because they're not assigned to a channel. So there's kind of an art to turning that into the actual channel assignment that goes on every day.
Sometimes it feels like a Van Gogh painting. Sometimes it just feels like watercolors or finger paints, whatever. Abstract art, whatever you want to say it is. It can get really, really difficult, especially on those Saturday afternoon cases where everybody and their brother has decided that they want to run the race at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And so what do you end up doing at that point? One of the things that I end up having to do is figure out, first of all, what is the priority here? Obviously, if you're deep into tournament, that's one of the considerations I have to give. Secondly, what kind of match is this? How long is the match? See whether or not it fits with something else that's going on in the schedule. Piece it together like a puzzle, and that's pretty much how I've treated this job since coming on board in 2017, is just to treat the schedule like it is a puzzle. Sometimes it perfectly fits. Sometimes I gotta jam that piece in.
The players love it when you do that.
Darn you and your 7:30 match, but seriously, I try to keep things as it is. But in certain cases, I might have to reach out to a runner, ask them whether or not they can move their match back a half an hour so they can help make the schedule fit a little bit better, because now we have a match that ended at 5 o'clock or started at 5 o'clock that's supposed to end at 8 o'clock. Now we have room to clear it. Because when you build a schedule, you also have to consider other things that may happen. Like, for instance, what happens if a certain thing happens? Like, both runners die in any percent race. They got to go back to start, and you got to determine who's going to be the winner. So you might have a race that restarts. You might have a runner who loses their internet just before the start of a race, or you might have the power go out
Nobody's had that happen.
Nobody's had
No,
that
hasn't
happen
happened.
this
No,
week.
Nope.
So those are the kind of things you got to get into consideration, and pretty much what it comes down to is a puzzle. Sometimes people like what channels I put them on. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes I feel like I should just be throwing darts at a dartboard, but it's not. It's harder than to do that. And like I said, it's just a puzzle, and sometimes that scheduled page looks like a beautiful painting at the end, and sometimes it's like
Chaos. Utter chaos.
Controlled chaos.
And I will say this, though, big shout-outs to Fiesel in getting that scheduling tools in there. As he mentioned earlier about the Google Sheets, because that was a nightmare, because sometimes you had the Google Sheets, and the way those forms came in is that some of the new matches popped on the very, very bottom, but the problem is that the way they sometimes move the scheduling is that it was all the way on the very, very bottom, and you missed that match. Guess what? The runner's going, what channel am I on? What match? Okay.
You have a race today?
You have a race today? Okay, sorry. I'd talk about it more, but we've got a few other things we want to discuss before the Q&A.
All right, so briefly, once the things are in the schedule and we have to run the day-to-day, as a stage manager, me and JC and Saku kind of, and Rick kind of, everybody has to do a little bit of it now and then. We basically oversee the setup helper and broadcast operator volunteers, making sure that they have everything they need to do to keep everything running, and that if there's something wrong with the machine, then I can remote into it and see that, hey, I'll schedule my Windows update now and dismiss that so that the tools will work again. Or sometimes, there are no volunteers around and somebody has to step up and make sure that the show goes on. Or maybe you have to coordinate. We have foreign language channels now, and sometimes we have a dual broadcast between the two, and you need to make sure that it's all working together. Sometimes the problems are a little more in-depth than something a volunteer can handle, so while I'm remoted in, if it's not a Windows update issue, got to figure that out. And then occasionally we have like a special events that require a close eye and a dedicated stage manager person to sit there and pay attention to them, and JC does that a lot. Shout-outs to JC not being here today. That's all I've got on stage managing.
Well, I think we want to go make sure we have enough time for everyone to ask their questions. I want to thank everyone for watching this panel, and we're happy to take your questions here, and if you want to talk to us afterwards, please do. Also, I'd like to remind everyone we're going to have a SpeedGaming meetup happening, and we're going to go over to the hotel lobby bar area, and anyone who's a volunteer or a friend of SpeedGaming or just at all interested in hanging out with the SpeedGaming crowd and wants to come with us, we'll be doing that. We said tentatively 4:30, but I think we'll just go straight over there after this is over. But you're welcome to talk to us, after this panel here, or to go over there and ask any of us questions that you don't feel like asking here on the mic. So thank you everyone for watching this panel.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And the mic is over there.
Yeah, line up.
mic's
If you have
over
a
there.
question, line up, and we'll.
We don't have time for too many questions, so you guys feel free to line you up, but I might have to send you guys back. So just keep on coming. We'll see what happens.
Hi. So this is a little bit of a controversial question. So I apologize beforehand. I do see a lot of similarities between speedrunning tournaments and esports. So you have commentators, and rather than team-based teams, speedrunning is more of a personal best event like a track and field event. Can you talk briefly about the similarities and the differences you see between speed gaming tournaments and esports, and advantages or disadvantages to approaching speed gaming as an esport?
Right. So I often compare most esports to like football or basketball, and speed gaming to like track or golf or something like that. Because you really are in speedrunning, you're talking about two people who are both trying to do their best at a particular thing, but there's not really a lot of contact between them. Now, theoretically, there is some interaction between players in that players can, if you really know a lot about the game, you can adapt your strategies. You can go from doing risky things if you're behind to doing really safe things if you're ahead. And you can even calculate if you're watching the other player's stream or the restream, if I'm ahead by this amount, I can afford to lose a few seconds to take safer strats here or there. I think we're gradually moving into a lot more closer to interactive things now, especially like with with like lockout bingos and things like that. And now there's all this like cross-cart connections that we can do, like a lot of team races where, you know, I can pick up an item and it appears on Mythical's tracker or something like that, and vice versa. I think in the future we'll probably see things that are a little bit closer to that. But for the most part, I think speedrunning is a sort of a different audience than the people who watch like fighting games or Counter-Strike or something like that, and that it is a lot more focused on, you know, individual performance under pressure as opposed to like, you know, physically challenging the other person directly. So I think it's a bit of a different audience, and maybe that means that speedrunning has less of a you know, a lower viewer cap, you know, a lower interest cap than some of the other esports do. But I think a lot of the difference that you see really just comes from the fact that speedrunning is newer and people just, you know, aren't quite aware of what it is. The majority of games that are made are single-player games. So most games that people have, most games that people play are not stuff that would ever appear on an esports stage, but we'll speedrun anything. So,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's also a lot of room to move away from a traditional head-to-head format. That's something that makes a lot of sense for, say, a fighting game or something. But you know, with SpeedGaming could you know, move to something like a SpeedGaming League, and recently the Twitch Rivals event for Mega Man 11 had a format where you would have a certain amount of time to post a best time. We could do heats like track and field. If you've got a multi-game event like Ultimate Decathlon, they would assign points based off of your time to give equal weighting to games at different length. There's tons of room for experimentation that fits something closer to what we do. So that's something that we're already trying to do a little bit, and I think we're going to continue to move in that direction.
absolutely.
Now, you've mentioned repeatedly the use of the tools that you use, and that developing and working with tools that are specialized is a very, very important thing. And my main question is, do you ever have any intent on open sourcing some of those to help out other channels? Because I know I could use a lot of those.
Yeah, there actually are a number of good tools that are out there that are already open source. A lot of what we do is very specific to exactly what we're doing and exactly the machines that we are using, and they don't have any kind of installer. It takes me about 4 or 5 hours just to outfit one machine with the tools we have. But some of it, yes, I think some of it eventually we definitely could make available, although to be honest, there's some, for the Link to the Past randomizer tournament, for the secondary streams and for the streams on ALTTPR channels, they have some really good tools that have been developed that I think a lot of people will eventually start using. Also, a lot of what we do can now be done with, I know like Stream Elements has a certain setup where you can make all of your layouts like on this control panel, like, you know, a web-based control panel, and, you know, do all the scene switching from there, and you don't have to do anything on your actual broadcast machine. So the tools already are out there to use. You just got to be sort of aware of, you know, where to find them. But definitely, like, yeah, a lot of the stuff that we do have, you know, eventually we will try to, you know, integrate it into tools that other people can use, you know, to the extent that it would be useful to anyone besides us.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, Feasible.
Hi.
So obviously a lot of interaction being admin that utilizes SpeedGaming on a normal basis with the Zelda 1 randomizer tournaments. So I know that we've often come to you beforehand with a new layout or anything. Can you just go into a little bit of how much time that takes you for your setup before a tournament with any of an outside community with the implementation of a new layout or whatever?
Okay, yeah. So the amount of time it takes depends on how much time I have. Sometimes we get a layout like 10 minutes before the first race is supposed to start. And so then in that case, it takes 10 minutes. But normally it takes maybe about, I'd say half an hour or so to like get the layout set up. Mostly it's just a matter of deciding what the dynamic elements are going to be on the stream, where the layouts are going to go, where the text is going to go, where the commentators are going to go. With trackers, it's a bit more complicated than that. The tracker that we use is not like the trackers that that you would use if you were doing it on your own stream, where you just click the thing and it appears. And it has its disadvantages. The back end interface is a little clunky, as anyone who's tracked knows. But it's that way for a lot of reasons: simplicity of implementation, and just so that it's nice and easy to work on any kind of device. You can run off your phone or something like that if you need to. But yeah, making trackers is usually the more complicated part. That might take me about 3 or 4 hours to make the tracker for a new tournament that's come in. Like I made the Wind Waker tracker that SpeedGaming uses pretty recently. That took me about 3.5 hours. And just a simple layout that's got a couple of elements on it. A timer, game screen, player name, commentator, that could be done in 15 minutes.
Or 10 if he's really rushed.
Or 10, or 5 sometimes. Or sometimes I do just the game screens and then I update it while the match is actually happening to add the other stuff.
The show must go on.
Yeah.
Hey, I have sort of a personal question for Fiesel and Mithy, and feel free to answer as little or as in depth as you want. But earlier on in Speed Gaming, when you guys were doing all of the work by yourselves, I was just curious if you guys had full-time jobs or part-time jobs at that time, or if you decided to put that on hold. Like, what kind of personal sacrifices in other areas did you guys have to make in order to make this work? And I super appreciate, what you did. So that's why I'm kind of curious
Thank
about
you
it.
very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I had like a part-time job for a little bit, but I really had a lot of free time to devote on my end, whereas I think Fiesel had to walk a tightrope, really.
Yeah, I was, right, when I first started Speed Gaming, and I was also streaming at the time too, and I did have a job as working for a research lab at university, and it was nice because that it had a really flexible schedule. I wouldn't have been able to start Speed Gaming if I didn't have a flexible schedule. But I was less and less interested in that and more interested in doing, the more the entrepreneurial route and doing something out of my own, and wanting to put my software development skills to use doing something else. And so I I dropped down to part-time with that, and then eventually started working remotely, and then eventually started working just occasionally for like individual contracts, and just gradually like tapered off the other work I was doing. Although for a very long time I just was living off my savings, because Speed Gaming didn't make any money for years at all. I mean, even now it barely does, but back then like nothing. And as far as like personal sacrifice, I mean, I would say if it's something that you really love, you really have to put your time into it, and you have to put all your time into it. And there were, I'd say for maybe a year and a half, I had almost no social life. I didn't do anything. I would just work on Speed Gaming, which was fine because I loved it. But that kind of thing definitely takes a toll on you. So it's something to be aware of. If you really have something that you're passionate, that you want to work on, just like make sure that you're okay with the fact that you're going to have to just devote yourself to it to the exclusion of everything else in your life, and just be banking on like future happiness at the expense of like current happiness. And make sure that what you're doing gives you enough personal satisfaction that you'll be okay with that, putting in that kind of effort over that period of time.
I gotta work this device here.
Yeah.
All right, that's actually a perfect segue into my question, which is also for Fiesel. So my eyes honestly watered a little bit when Mythical was saying like how much work you put in early on, and so I'm just curious, kind of, what is it exactly? You've been through all these not so much failures, but like projects that didn't pan out the way you wanted, like SGL, like you had to put that on hold just because it was so much work. What would you say, like, what is it about speedrunning what is about that tickles your passion, like, and just keeps you through these, like, project after project after project, you just keep drilling them out? And also, kind of as a cheating second parter, how would you say that kind of your optimism graph on this whole thing has been over time?
Oh, goodness. All right. Why speedrunning in general? Oh man, I loved speedrunning. I started doing it before I even knew what speedrunning was. Back then, there was like in the late 2000s and such, there weren't really a lot of communities of people speedrunning. It was really just SDA, and it wasn't so. There was no GDQ. It wasn't obvious like to most people what speedrunning was. But I think when I was a kid, if you were to ask me what do you want to be when you grow up, I would say a ninja. That's what I wanted to be. I wanted to like train at something and get really good at it and just be like a superhuman skill in some really specific thing. And speedrunning is probably the closest that someone like me will ever get to that. But I don't know, I found it really satisfying to do something over and over again. I have the kind of mind where I just like to do repetitive tasks, and I always, like, everything that I do, even if it's like making a quesadilla, if I do it enough, like, I start to route how I'm going to do it and like optimize that, So like that, it just naturally made sense to me, and I got a lot of satisfaction out of it, just doing the same thing over and over again and improving at it and like watching my skill increase. So, I always will be interested in speedrunning. As far as like doing something bigger than that, I mean, I guess I kind of have always tried to think myself as like an inventor. I like to come up with new things and new ideas, and just it seemed anytime I see something that like, hey, that's something that someone should do, I think, well, why not me? I've got the skills to do it. Why don't I try it? And that's kind of what started me with Sunday Sequence Break, what started me with Speed Gaming League, what started me with doing tournaments, and then with doing Speed Gaming as it is now. Just the drive to do something new and different that no one's done before.
Fiesel cooking stream when?
We'll see. Maybe.
And as far as that like optimism graph goes, what would you say is like the peak moment where you hit like and you finally realize like, yeah, this is gonna work. This is gonna become something.
When December Madness was successful, end of 2017.
Yeah. Nice. Cool.
I think that was also the first time Speed Gaming was like finally in the black. Like,
right. Yeah.
That was good.
Cool. Thank you. This has been an awesome panel.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries. Upper one? Okay. A little better. Well, first of all, thank you so much to all the Speed Gaming staff for everything you do. I kind of have a two-part question. So my first question is, what made the push to go from Speed Gaming 1 through 6, 7, 8, to also including an international community, Speed Gaming Français, Deutsch, and Espagnol? So what made that move forward, and were there any barriers, like language barriers or any other type that kind of hindered you along the way?
Yes,
right.
Yes, there were.
Yes.
In terms of it was Fiesel who wanted to do the languages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's me throwing over to you to answer.
Okay, sure. Got it. It's basically goes back to Blecky's question. Like, I mean, I spend a lot of time just like laying there staring at the ceiling, thinking, what am I not doing? What should I be doing? What's haven't I thought of yet? And the language thing really, I think, is kind of low-hanging fruit. There's a whole, like, I think maybe 50% of the people who watch Speed Gaming or participate are not necessarily native English speakers. So, it's quite obvious that there's a lot of people out there who would love to see, things in their own language. And, it just seemed like an obvious thing for me to do. And no one was doing it. I mean, there were a few instances like, the Ultimate Decathlon brought in a lot of French runners, but, it wasn't supposed to be, there we go, right? It wasn't supposed to be, a specifically French event, but I thought, there's communities out there that would really like to, build up, like the Francophone speedrunning and, the German-speaking speedrunning, things like that, and it just seemed like an obvious thing to do. And yes, there have been challenges. The fact that I don't really speak any of these languages, so anytime we put out an announcement, anytime we need to like translate text in a bot message, I have to rely on people to translate it for me. And just in doing the initial set of translations, I like took all the text strings in all the Speed Gaming backend, and I made like a big paste bin. And I would ask like 3 different people to try to translate it into like French, for instance, and I would get 3 completely different translations. Right? And for all the languages, that's what it's like. Everyone had a completely different way of translating it, and no one could agree, even among themselves, what was the most accurate thing. Right? Also, one of the things that kind of bit us a little bit is we had especially
community
with
dispute.
With the French, we had to make sure that we, like at first I was thinking, it'll be the French, speedrunning thing. Well, when you say that, like, are you saying with a capital F or a lowercase f? Because 50% of the French-speaking people are in France and 50% are in Canada, and they don't want to be called French because that means you're in France. So we had to keep reminding ourselves to say Francophone instead of French for all of our tournaments, and we've run into problems on a few occasions where we forgot to tell the commentators that, and but just understanding that like the different language groups have their own specific things that are really important to them in order to make sure they're represented well. And we're still getting the hang of that. I don't think we've really perfected that yet.
Yeah, we're also trusted in our translators a lot. If none of us, at the highest level of decision making, don't speak the language, we're getting secondhand information only. So when there was a dispute between some German-speaking tournament organizers, it was like a he said, she said sort of situation, and we were really grasping at how to weigh in on the decision ourselves when we couldn't actually tell what they were saying. So we do really need to find people that we very highly trust when we work with people who do our translation for us. And it's a little scary. It's still something we're still figuring out.
Cool. Well, for anybody who's been restreamed on speaking français, merci beaucoup.
I'm going to have to abuse my executive authority here.
All right.
Fiesel, now that Speed Gaming is a successful venture, I must ask, on behalf of all of us, when is the return of Fiesel Cam?
Maybe we'll devote a whole channel to it. Fiesel Cam channel.
It's just going to be the whole time.
It's just tapping away at a keyboard, and every now and then, just like a chip.
Quesadilla percent.
Right, yeah. All right, well, thank you, everyone, for watching the panel. And come join us over in the hotel bar/lobby, and we'll have a little meetup for everyone who wants to get together.
Can we just get a big shout out for Fiesel for everything he's done for this?
Yeah. Well, shout out to all the volunteers. The volunteers are the most important people in speed gaming. Thank you so much.